In this interactive video, we're going to discuss um, the next historical period in relationship to mythology. The next historical period that Karen Armstrong discusses, which is known as, by some scholars, as the Axial Age. And that occurs between roughly 800 and 200 BCE. And this is a pretty intense um, video because of the claims that axial age theorists make about this time. Mm. So just warning you, it's a heavy one. So, this puts us here roughly. Mm. Now, Karl Jaspers was a philosopher and a psychiatrist, and he's the one that coined this concept of the axial age. And what he means by that is he's referring to the period between, like I said, 800 and 200 BCE. And he says during that period, the intellectual, philosophical, and religious systems that came to shape subsequent human society and culture emerged. Just like, boom, it just happened in this relatively brief period of time in these very specific areas, right? So it's an age in which humanity pivots, like the basketball players pivoting, and the notion of the individual as separate from others and the world begins to emerge. It's a new way of understanding self and the world. And that's what he coined the axial age. And in this period, a variety of religions and doctrines started developing, and some of which, they're still in practice today. It was a time that was characterized by the emergence of universalizing, moralizing ideologies and universal ethics that were professed through prominent world historical figures. And many of them you're familiar with, like the Buddha, Confucius, Lao Tzu, Zarathustra, the Hebrew prophets, Homer, and Plato all came all hit the scene during this period, this pivotal period. So typically each belief was rooted in a specific geographical area, and each developed its own value system, but they remarkably had quite a bit in common. And Jasper's idea is that this period was a demythologizing revolution in worldviews. So myths were localized, specific, and nature oriented, but the ideologies that emerged during this period, the axial age, were universal, general, and morality oriented. You see, what he's trying to say here is that during this axial age, people went from like separate, disconnected, local ideas and thoughts and codes, and all of a sudden, thinking became more universalized and and morality oriented. So this was part of his idea. So here is the places where the axial age took hold. Now, the axial age again is a theory. Mm. And some historians say, oh, it's a coincidence that during this 600-year period, all of these major groups, major systems of thought and historical world figures came out of these areas. It's just a coincidence. It may be, but we're going with it for the sake of her argument, of Karen Armstrong's argument, that there was this flowering of activity during the 600-year period. Now, further on the concept of the axial age, Jaspers describes it as an interregnum between two ages of great empire, a pause for liberty, a deep breath bringing the most lucid consciousness. And it's also been suggested that the axial age was what's known as a historically liminal period, And if you look down here, right, this is what liminal means. It's like you have the past and the future, and the liminal period is kind of the period that combines a little bit of both of them, right? It's not yet the future, it's not yet the past. The old ideas aren't quite gone, the new ones aren't there. You just got this stew of two different, basically historically bound ways of thinking that are crossing over. That's liminality, right? So old certainties lost their validity, but they were still clung to. So like the old myths were still clung to, even though people doubted them. And the new ones, the new ways of thinking weren't quite ready. They weren't quite ripe yet. So it's kind of a period of flux. So similarities between them included an engagement in the quest for human meaning and the rise of a new elite class of religious leaders and thinkers in China, India, and the Mediterranean. So this is what was common amongst those different places where you see that the axial age terminology pertains to. And these spiritual foundations were laid by individual thinkers within a framework of like we discussed, a really changing social environment. And Jaspers also argues that there were similar political circumstances during this axial period, 800 to 200 BCE, similar enough that it kind of explains why the thought was changing so radically in this relatively short period of time. So these regions, the one we just saw on the maps, all gave birth to and then institutionalized a tradition of traveling scholars who roamed from city to city to exchange ideas. So you can see what that means as well, right? We've got traveling scholars and people moving around into different cultures and different places and spreading ideas and you know um, fertilizing each other. So further, Jaspers says Confucius and Lao Tzu were living in China. All the schools of Chinese philosophy came into being, including those of Mo-Ti, Shuangzi, Lao Tzu, and a host of others. India produced the Upanishads and Buddha, and, like China, ran the whole gamut of philosophical possibilities down to materialism, skepticism, and nihilism. In Iran, Zarathustra taught a challenging view of the world as a struggle between good and evil. In Palestine, the prophets made their appearance from Elijah by way of Isaiah and Jeremiah to Deutero-Isaiah. Greece witnessed the appearance of Homer, of the philosophers Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Plato, of the tragedians, of Thucydides and Archimedes. Everything implied by these names developed during these few centuries almost simultaneously in China, India, and the West. The spiritual foundations of humanity were laid simultaneously and independently, and these are the foundations upon which humanity still subsists today. And that's a mouthful. That was a mouthful for me, right? But think of the magnitude of the claim he's making. So further, Jaspers observed that during this period, there was like a shift or turn, like it was like pivoting on an axis away from, like we said earlier, localized, local concerns and toward general concerns and what's known as transcendence. Transcendence literally means to go beyond or to move beyond. And in the case of the Axial Age revolution in human thought about the world, transcendence has several meanings, according to the Canadian philosopher and sociologist Charles Taylor. So Charles Taylor argues that some of these meanings are a shift to thinking about the cosmos and the way it works, rather than taking for granted that it works. The rise of second order thinking about the ways that human beings even think about the universe in the first place and come to know it. So we're talking about introspective thought, being conscious of consciousness itself. Part of the argument of the axial age is that this is when consciousness of consciousness began to arise. That's a heavy duty thought. Introspective thought was born in this period, is part of the claim. And further, a turn away from merely appeasing tribal or civic deities and towards speculation about the fate of humanity, about human beings' relationships with the cosmos, and about the good and how human beings can be good. Major shift in thinking once again. So let's take a look briefly through some of these. China in the Axial Age, we've got Confucius, and Confucianism originated around 551 to 479 BCE in China and was based on the teachings of Confucius, who was a thinker and social philosopher. He's considered an Axial Age thinker. So his philosophy emphasized moral, personal, and governmental morality, correct social relationships, justice, and sincerity, and did so directly without too much mythological imagery. And according to Confucius, each person should act with virtue in all social matters, including family, community, state, and kingdom, to ensure order and unity. And years after Confucius's death, his teachings were compiled in his book, which ended up being called the Analects. So also, another example of changing thought in China in the Axial Age is Taoism. And Taoism is a philosophical, ethical, and religious tradition that's attributed to Lao Tzu. And Taoism seeks to live in harmony with the Tao. And the name the Tao denotes something that's both the source and the driving force behind everything that exists. And according to Taoism, opposite and contradictory aspects, namely yin and yang, which you've all seen the symbol for or heard the terms of, are present in all things. And Taoism emphasizes concepts such as naturalness, spontaneity, simplicity, and detachment from desires. His thinking is compiled, by the way, in a book called the Tao Te Ching. So another area, different geographical area during the Axial Age was India. Sorry, I was being repetitive there. But Buddhism originated during this period, sometime between 563 and 483 BCE, and was based on the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama. And Siddhartha Gautama was born into a wealthy, high caste family. And at around 29, he renounced his privileged condition and committed himself to an ascetic life, which is a life deprived of any kind of pleasures or, a life of extreme, what's the word I'm looking for here? Lack. A Spartan life, a very minimal life. And then later he became a sage, a philosopher, a teacher, and eventually what is sometimes referred to as a religious leader. And Buddhism attracted many followers because of its simple and clear, really direct teachings that promote pluralism, peace, and tolerance, and because it offered an alternative to the Varna system that divided society into castes. So Buddha believed in four fundamental truths, namely that life is full of suffering, that all suffering is caused by desire, and that one must renounce desire to rise above suffering, and that the only way to get rid of desire is to follow the practices of what's known as the Eightfold Path. And he dictated that the elements of this eightfold path are in accordance with what we've been saying, right? Where we've got to shift away from old mythology style myths, the old forms of myths, to new, like, direct. How should I behave in the world? How should everybody behave in the world? Right? So you can see this echoed here as well. He dictated right views, right intentions, right speech, right actions, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And also, reincarnation is central in Buddhism, and true salvation can be attained when rebirths stop and the individual reaches nirvana, or the state of enlightenment. So, another system of thought that emerged in during this Axial Age from between 800 and 200 BCE. Another one from India that emerged during this relatively brief period is Jainism. And its spiritual ideas and history are traced through a succession of 24 saviors and teachers known as Tirthankaras. And the last one of those, called Mahavira, was a contemporary of Buddha. And he's remembered as the one who revived and reorganized the religion. Now, the fundamental principle of Jainism is ahimsa, or the belief that one must abandon all violent activity and commit to nonviolence, because otherwise all religious behavior is worthless. And Jainism holds that all living things have a soul and that all souls have the potential for the divine. Further, Jainism has a strong ascetic tradition, right? Living on minimal amounts of food, pleasure, living a very Spartan, severe life, right? An austere life, right? And they had 6 outer and 6 inner austerity practices, right? Like their outer austerities included complete fasting, eating limited amounts, eating restricted items, abstaining from tasty foods, mortifying the flesh, like self-flagellation, like whipping yourself or sitting on a bed of nails, and guarding the flesh by avoiding anything that is a source of temptation. And then the inner austerities include expiation, confession, respecting and assisting the poor, studying, meditation, and ignoring bodily wants in order to abandon the body. So, in Jainism, asceticism is viewed as a way to control desires and purify the soul. And Mahavira set an example of leading this sort of ascetic life by performing severe austerities for 12 years. So there are similarities between Jainism and Buddhism, and they were contemporary. But the main point here is that, boom, this hit the stage, the world stage, during this Axial Age period also. So let's take a look at the Middle East in the Axial Age. So Zoroastrianism was founded by Zoroaster, who's also known as Zarathustra, who was an ancient Persian spiritual leader who lived between 1500 and 1000 BC. So that's a little bit earlier than our period, but it runs into it. So eventually, one of the world's oldest continuously practiced creeds, Zoroastrianism was the official religion of the Persian Empire. And it was based on the Manichaean idea of a dualistic universe divided between good and evil, like a battle. And even though it promoted monotheism, it acknowledged the existence of two deities, Ahura Mazda, who is benevolent and good, and Ahiram, who is deceitful and wicked. And each individual person was believed to have free will and the ability to choose between good and evil, which ultimately determined his or her fate. Zoroastrianism states that active and ethical participation in life through good deeds, good thoughts, and good words is necessary to ensure happiness and to keep chaos at bay. And further, according to Zoroastrianism, life's purpose is to bring happiness into the world, contributing to the cosmic battle against evil. Once again, so although Zarathustra lived between 1500 and 1000 BC, we're lacking information there. Zoroastrianism really began to flourish with these ideas that were discussed down here during the Axial Age, once again, which was between 800 and 200 BCE. Notice once again, instead of localized tribal myths, what we have is moralizing, right? What is good? What is bad? What is the nature of the universe, right? Just like the Buddha was speculating on that, and Lao Tzu and Confucius, um, and Jainism, right? What's the nature of the world? What's our place in it? How ought we behave? So was the school of thought known as Zoroastrianism. See how all of these are sort of are connected? So we'll see some more. Told you this one was going to be heavy. Further, in the Middle East, the Hebrew prophets like Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel came to view the God of their nation, Israel, as the God who created heaven and earth and who shaped the destiny of all people. And Israel's Axial Age prophets no longer saw Yahweh as a God of war or one who appeased by, one who you could make happy by just empty rituals. They emphasized a more individual relationship with Yahweh that involved individual responsibility, morality, and justice, a more personal relationship with God, where you're held to account more as an individual as opposed to just going through the motions. Remember, I just wanted to take a moment to pause here. Remember that we're doing, a scholastic study of mythology and how it moved throughout history. This isn't meant to, hopefully none of this is offensive to anybody who is religious here. It certainly isn't intended to be. This is a scholastic study. Okay, just wanted to drop that in there again. So it was while in exile in Babylon in the 6th century BCE that Jews learned that Yahweh could be worshipped away from the temple and began to conceive of him as the one true God who transcends borders and empty ritual. It was a big move toward monotheism, right? And Jewish scholars began to collect and redact the memories, stories, and events from written and oral tradition, quite possibly to preserve their identity, that would create what we know today as the Old Testament. And the Old Testament was believed to be written between 1200 and 165 BCE. So, Axial Age material, once again. I mean, you could start to see why Jaspers and other thinkers would be like, what the heck happened during this 600-year period that just went, where things went pivoted so critically, so incredibly from the way they used to be. And then there's Greece in the Axial Age. So it's largely the Greek method of thinking that the Western world has inherited. So the rediscovery of Greek science and philosophy in medieval Europe, by the way, kindled the Renaissance. And how we study this legacy itself is a product of that legacy. Like, we separate our search for knowledge into Greek categories like politics, philosophy, history, and the individual sciences. That all came from the Greeks, the ancient Greeks. And even the words we use for these disciplines are typically taken from the words used by the Greeks. Technology, economics, logic, Even our word school is taken from the Greek schole. So a lot of us, a lot of you out there know that, right? And Greece, further in the Axial Age, we see the beginnings of democracy with Solon. And Solon told the Athenians that their unstable political situation could not be blamed on a divine cause, but was the result of human selfishness. All citizens, he said, should accept responsibility for this dysnomia or disorder. And in his view, the solution lay in their hands, the people's hands, and only a collaborative political effort could restore eunomia, or good order and stability. And eunomia was about balance. It meant that no one sector of society should dominate the others. Another quote unquote axial age thought. Further in Greece, we see the emergence of Socrates, right? Who questioned the Athenians' most fundamental assumptions with his, the Socratic method. He didn't call it that we call it that in retrospect, right? But went around and questioned the Athenians' motivations and what they believed, and started to change human beings' consciousness. And his student was Plato, who founded and this is right squarely in the Axial Age, who founded the first proto-university called the Academy, and instructed students from all over the Greek world in metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, natural and mathematical sciences. Plato is also considered one of the founders of both Western religion and spirituality, heavily influenced Christianity too. And Plato's student was Aristotle, 384 to 322. All of these see squarely in that period. He founded his own school called the Lyceum, and Aristotle laid the foundations of Western science, logic, and philosophy. So in physical science, Aristotle studied anatomy, astronomy, economics, embryology, geography, geology, meteorology, and just everything. He was relentless. He also studied education, foreign customs, literature, and poetry. Right? Socrates, Plato, Aristotle here. So, part of the axial age theory of Karl Jaspers is that this period bore witness to the end of myth as humanity had known it previously. Now, I know what we just went through was way heavy. I mean, we just hit the big changes in world philosophy in, 15 minutes, 20 minutes? That was a lot to take in. So let's wrap up the point. Axial age, what the theory is. Somebody named it that. Not everybody buys into this, but people do go, hey, what the heck was going on in this relatively short period in these seemingly separate areas of the world where the thinking took a turn away from myth as we knew it and started to become more what's known as universal, aiming for more universality, with more of a focus on the individual's role in the universe, how he or she ought to behave. What is the good? What is the good for humanity, not just for our tribe, for instance? And that this big shift, this pivotal age, started to usher in the end of myth as humanity had known it. So, furthermore, this is where the battle of rationality and practical experience against myth began to take hold, is part of Jaspers' argument. Because remember, what Karen Armstrong's argument ultimately is that logos, logical, rational thinking, has won out and dominated over mythos, magical, mythical thinking. And that might not be the best thing for us, as will, I'm just reminding you what her central thesis here is. So what we're looking at is tracing this period. This is when both Jaspers and Karen Armstrong argued that myth was starting to hit the trash can, right? Mythos out, logos in. Religion became informed with ethics. The idea of divinity was enhanced. The myth became the vehicle of a language that expressed something entirely different from what the myth had originally meant. Myth became parable, a story like a story with a moral. And myths were transformed and given new depth. And during this transition period, new myths were still produced, even while the myth as a whole was being destroyed. Remember, this, once again, I know I'm being repetitive, but it's sometimes helpful to keep an eye on the argument since the argument is spanning a lot of chapters and a lot of weeks that we're studying it. This is the period where they're saying we're losing mythos and mythical thinking, and logos and logical thinking is taking its place. So the mythical world slowly receded, but it stuck around in the beliefs of the masses. And, so it was kind of the background of all life in that sense. It stayed in the imaginations of the everyday person, even though it was slowly getting trashed. But it was, it it still kind of hung around almost as a ghost, you know? So it's a cool map to put it into perspective how this, what Karl Jaspers would say is because of the big changes during this 600-year period that he named the Axial Age, look at what it has happened to the world in terms of its, religious thinking and spiritual thinking. Christianity, right, eventually comes to dominate the world, born of thinking that began in this period. Christ wasn't born during this period, but there would be no Christianity had there not been the Hebrew prophets that came from this period. Hinduism, Islam, right? This is like the map of how arguably those systems of thought and ways of thought that emerged that were revolutionary during this axial age eventually came to dominate the world. Okay, now let's hit the takeaways from Karen Armstrong's argument. Axial regions were all caught up in political, social, and economic upheaval. There were wars, deportations, massacres, and destruction of cities. A new market economy was also developing. Power was passing from priests and kings to merchants, and this disturbed the old hierarchies. All these new faiths developed not in remote deserts or mountain hermitages, but in an environment of capitalism and high finance, she argues. All the axial movements had essential ingredients in common. They were acutely conscious of the suffering that seemed an inescapable part of the human condition, and all stressed the need for a more spiritualized religion that was not so heavily dependent upon external rituals and practice. They had a new concern about the individual conscience and morality. Further, Axial Age sages taught their disciples to look within themselves for truth and not to rely on the teachings of priests or other religious experts. Nothing should be taken on trust, everything should be questioned, and the old values, hitherto taken for granted, must be subjected to critical scrutiny. One of the areas that required reevaluation was, of course, mythology, and people began to give their myths a more ethical and interior interpretation. But people no longer experienced the sacred or the transformative as easily as their ancestors. So the gods had already begun to retreat from the consciousness of some of the early city dwellers. People in the axial countries still yearned for transcendence, but the sacred now seemed remote and even alien. A gulf now separated mortals from their gods. They no longer shared the same nature. It was no longer possible to believe that gods and men derive from the same divine substance. These are the big takeaways from this chapter on the Axial Age systems of thought from Karen Armstrong's book. Whew! All right, everybody. Well, that was a heavy one. So we covered Karl Jaspers and the very concept of the Axial Age. Then we did Axial Age thought in China, India, the Middle Ages, and Greece. Then we did Karen Armstrong's argument takeaways. And then for the next module, like we've been doing, we will look at some examples of these quote unquote myths, what myths we're turning into, right? So I just call them Axial Age myths that we'll look at. Next module we'll look at a small piece from the Analects by Confucius, the simile of the chariot by the Buddha, a piece from the book of Ezekiel in the Bible, and the ring of Gyges by Plato.